Okay, might as well get started. First off, are there any questions or comments anyone has? Okay. I just sent you guys out an announcement. I just found well, about 10, 15 years ago, we were working with the archives, state archives, which is Department of DAGS, Department of Accounting and General Services. And we were involved in a project with them where we were scanning in the photos. The archives has this huge collection of pictures, going way back. And we were scanning that in for them. In fact, what you see here is an example of that, which they now have up on the website. The idea was to actually make this publicly available. One of the other projects they were working on at the time, which we weren't involved in, was the process of scanning in maps. These were both in other words, maps that exist in various state collections, like, for example, the Land Court Award of Maps. It turns out what they were also doing is they were also scanning in subdivision maps. So apparently, if you were going to have a subdivision area, you were going to want to build a bunch of houses in Hawaii. Way back even into the monarchy periods, you had to have a map showing, where this was going to be, what it was called, who was doing it, and all this information on a map, along with how you're going to break out the lots, which they still do. But I didn't realize they had them back that far. It turns out they'd scan those all in. So I just found those Monday afternoon. So I'm in the process of going through. But what it means, at least for our project, is that we actually can, if we can dig out where they are, we can actually pull up the subdivisions that were proposed for Pololo, which includes the name of the subdivision, or the marketing name they had for it, who the developer actually was, when it was done, and then what the size and all the stuffs were. I just found that Monday afternoon. I also pulled up some of the LCA maps, just because they're sort of handy. These are the ones we use a lot in my work, but it's also something that people make a lot of money. There's whole companies here that do nothing but search for land titles and land claims if you're thinking of buying a piece of property or doing something with a piece of property. And so what I did is the announcement, I actually attached an example of one of the maps for a small part of Waikiki, or more accurately Vaititi, showing the LCA awards to give you an idea how complex this is. This is actually what we're doing. The part of the project that I'm working on is basically collecting all the LCA awards for our part of the island within the Ahupua'a Vaititi, and then basically tracking down all the claimants and going back to the actual testimony they did in the 1840s, 1850s, when they said I should be given this piece of property, because at that point they had to say where it was, what they were doing with the property, and what its value was. So that's both in English and or Hawaiian, depending on who's doing the testimony. So I'm in the process of compiling all that. So that's my part of our Pololo project that you guys are also working on. Anyways, so what I want to do today is go over changes. We're going to spend a little time on Waikiki. For one reason, there's a lot of images, which makes it sort of handy. But also it's one of those situations where even when you look at the press and even government, sad to say, talking about either Waikiki improvements or things like beach erosion and stuff, they're oftentimes doing it without much awareness. In fact, at least in the case of some state agencies, no awareness of the fact that what they're actually trying to preserve was never actually there in the first place. The easiest way to do is actually show you images. Here's Vaititi Beach, or Waikiki Beach, 1890. And this is one of the great advantages of images. If you're actually looking at things like flora, fauna, environmental changes over time, images, especially older images like these, have tremendous advantages. For one thing, these things were all glass plate. So they're incredibly detailed. You can blow them up. Let's see if I can here. Well, this is actually a copy, so I'm not sure it'll blow up as well. Yeah. But you can see the level of detail is absolutely stunning. Much more stunning you'd get in a modern, even say, digital image. And that actually gives you some tremendous advantages because, for example, if you're looking at the faunal patterns that existed in Waikiki, in the late 19th century, you can very quickly realize the massive majority of this is actually Keawe. There's some Hawaiian coconut trees. Here's what's left of an old grove here. There's the big old grove down here. But what's really striking is when you look at this beach, what you realize is two things. One is, and of course everyone knew this back in the day, and was still the case in the 1890s, is Waikiki is actually a mud flat. Here's Pololo Stream drains in here at the edge of what's now Kapiolani Park. In fact, where Kapahulu Boulevard comes down. was the old spot where Palolo Stream came in. Manoa Stream came in about just the other side of what's the Moana Hotel. So about, I don't know, a couple of 100 meters from where these folks are, there'd be another stream coming in. So all of this is actually mud. This is actually erosional mud from Palolo, Manoa, and the other valleys that's washed down and settles here and mixes in with the coral sands. So what you've got is a combination of coral and mud. And that's why this beach looks the way it does. Notice that's fairly hard packed. It's not sandy per se. And notice all your main vegetation patterns is actually grasses. Now, what you notice if you actually look at this carefully, because you can actually align it to Diamond Head and the angle, is this is actually just about where Kalakaua Avenue is right here. So Waikiki Beach, as late as the late 19th century, was actually way Malka of where it is now. Waikiki Beach right now would be right about here. So when people talk about Waikiki beach erosion in the 21st century, how you've got to put sand across, you got to protect the beach. You're not protecting the beach that actually existed there prior to people screwing around with it. You're talking about basically protecting the sand that you dumped there in the 20th century to make the beach artificially, to move it both makai, seaward, and also make it more sand, which is much more erosion prone than sand mud mix. This stuff is not like concrete, but it doesn't go very far. And the ironic thing is what Mother Nature is trying to do now is strip the sand away and get back to the original beach, which would be just on the Makai side of Kalakaua Avenue. So everything you see here, well, actually, he's probably sitting right in the middle of Kalakaua Avenue, right here. So when you look at modern Waikiki and they talk about, especially dealing with the beaches, it's important to remember that you're not talking about the beaches that existed there prior to human intervention. You're talking about the beaches that have been artificially produced in the 20th century. Now, notice how there's also the lack of buildings here. The racetrack was already down here. That's at the end of the palm trees. So that's Kapilani Park down here. But notice there's not really a lot of stuff going on here. Now let's jump ahead 20 years. Oops. Here's 20 years later. This is slightly further up. Here's where the other picture was taken right here. So notice how now they've started to put sand in. Now notice how they haven't put it down here. They just put sand up here where people walk, because even in 1910, let's see if we can zoom in on this one. What's unusual about what these folks are wearing? In fact, that's a lady. That's actually quite risque. Anyone know what the morality laws were in the early 20th century for bathing? Up to, I believe, 1915, women could only show their ankles and their arms, and they couldn't show much below the neck. So if this is 1910, she's got tights on. She's not allowed to show her skin except her arms, feet, and basically the neck area and up. Men could wear shorts, but again, they had to have tops on. People no one was allowed to go, quote, topless, unquote. And that was the rules. And people were arrested quite frequently for exposing themselves. Usually men who would take their shirts off, that would be considered exposure, and the guys would be arrested, and that was a fine of, I don't know, whatever it was, because it was a public indecency thing. So you have to remember that in the early 20th century, even the images of place, if you notice all these folks have clothes on, women basically went into the water fully clothed. They would have beach outfits. But bathing suits in the modern sense don't show up till the late 1920s as part of the morality change in the 20s. And of course, the bikini starts, I believe, in France in the 1950s or something like that. So what people see as modern beachwear now is incredibly small and would have you arrested almost anywhere in the world, even into the 1950s or 1960s without any trouble at all. So, this guy's actually in a proper dress to go down to the beach. So the beach didn't serve the same function. The idea of getting suntans was anathema to people. That would make you sick, was in their view. So you didn't go to the beach to do the things that people do on the beach. Now, you went to the beach to go fishing or play in the water, and then you'd go and you'd dry off and you'd go, and sit in the shade somewhere and drink something. The other thing that's noticeable in this particular image is if you notice you've got, I believe, one of these is, I think maybe that one is, one of these is the actual original outrigger clubhouse. And here's the pier that went to, I can't remember what the name of that place was. There was one boarding house here. The rest of these are private residences. In fact, if it segues over here, yeah. Here's part of what I think is one of the cookhouses. So remember I mentioned that in the late 19th, early 20th century, what you had is Waikiki had become the place where if you had money and you lived downtown, you had a weekend residence. And this gives you an idea of these weekend residences. We're not talking like, small condos. We're talking, major mansions. And these would be, that might be the Dole. I think the Dole family had theirs somewhere around here. I'm not sure which. That might have been one of the castles. I think the castle had 3 or 4 in this part of Waikiki. So Waikiki originally gets its image from the very, very wealthy, powerful people here that were using Waikiki. And so if you weren't part of the wealthy and powerful, you were this couple here. In fact, yeah, I think she does have tights on. Then you would go wander down here to sort of check out what the powerful people are doing and hang around in places they hang out. So that's what Waikiki was. Waikiki was the playground of the wealthy. And its main function was the fact that you had access to a very good, very safe surge brake system for swimming, which, it had been for a while before that, but this sort of is the classic image of this. So notice the changes just in that 20-year period. You've gone from basically a grass-covered mudflat with a shoal area to now that grass has now been buried underneath sand. And you're starting to sort of image this place as a sand beach. And so it's changing, it's morphing into a different form. Gotta quit doing it that way. I forgot to set up this other one. Here we go. Oh, wait, this is the one. Actually, let's switch this. Okay. So if we jump ahead another 30 years, so we're now 1950, we have this. So notice how this whole area has been infilled. So now you have the modern arc of Waikiki, but of course what happened is it actually went back this way. You still have Kapiolani Park, so if you notice you actually still have a fair amount of the palm trees, which is just about the only way you can orient yourself. But this entire area is artificial. And of course what happens after the 1950s and more of the hotels encroach on this area and actually build into this area here to the point where the beach becomes much narrower. So all of this is artificial. All this is very, very recent. All this occurred between that 1920 and the 1950. In fact, pretty much in the 40s and 50s was when this all got built. So when you talk about this beach erosion, and which is they're spending millions and millions of dollars on right now, it's sort of an interesting project because you're trying to stabilize something that was never put there by Mother Nature. It was never stabilized by virtue of the currents and the water and the land conditions. And of course, you've also taken away the streams bringing down sediments and fresh water into here and right into about here, which helped to build and keep that whole beach area stabilized in the original form it was. You're now taking that water out and you put it in the Illinois Canal. So this entire Waikiki is entirely artificial. It's like in a very large man-made swimming hole. And so when you look at all this, it's important to remember when you walk down Waikiki, you're not walking on the normal situation. That original picture, that guy was sitting right about here, I think, in that first picture. And so and of course, this is the 1950s. So if you look at that picture now, it's changed, yet again in a totally stunning way. This is all built up, etc. So when you talk about Waikiki and the changes and the environmental changes, they're absolutely stunning. Among other things, what you find is when you bring in all this sand, which originally is from parts of Oahu, then on the windward side, then they start shipping in sand right through the 1970s from the beach dunes in the west end of Molokai, at which point they suddenly have to cease and desist because they're bringing up huge numbers of human bones or iwi are coming up in the sands in Waikiki from burials in the west part of Molokai. They then switch to where they bring the sand in now, which is from Maui and Wailuku. It's right below Pilani Heiau. And it's actually right in the middle of a Chinese cemetery. So they still, when they bring in the sand now and dump the sand, very frequently it's got humans' bones that are usually either Hawaiian or Chinese. So Waikiki is a strange place. And one of the side effects of all this is when you bring all this material in, because of you've now gotten rid of the soil mix. Now it's just sand, so it's much more mobile. It moves around much more. It's much grainier. You now completely killed all the reef off here, which was one of the things that the older sand-mud combination of the original Waikiki, you could have a very healthy reef system because that sand mud was basically filtering water and stabilizing. Now this whole area is destabilized. It's just artificial and it's sloppy. And now there's nothing living out here whatsoever. Waikiki coral beds are completely dead and have been for about 40 or 50 years. And that's one of the side effects of this beach. So in building the famous Waikiki beach, you basically kill the very situation that made Waikiki what it was in the first place. And that's the reef. And you bury the original beach, which was what made it so attractive. So. Now, if you remember that 1910 picture, what you've got is this start of attraction of Waikiki. As your wealthy move down there in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, start building these large homes. You get the big racetrack out there, and people start spending a lot of time, especially in the weekends, in Waikiki. What happens is they start to complain, and what they're complaining about is this. Okay, this is the back end of Waikiki. Let's see, I'm trying to figure out how to orient this. This is sort of a right angle, so we're looking towards the ocean here. We're looking at Makai. This would be back probably about the middle or the end of the Alawai Golf Course. Looking down here this way. I'm not really too sure. I haven't really thought this out. I think this is around Apua Kehau, I think. There's several notes here. This is from 1863 or something like that. So this, if you notice, you don't see buildings on the shore. This is when Waikiki is still a functional area. Having said that, this is one of the royal or ari'i palm clusters. I'm not sure what the technical term would be. But if you notice a lot of these palm trees, they're bent. If you notice, there's one here that's got kinks in it, and a bunch of these have kinks in them. I didn't realize till when we were working in the late 70s in Kalapana in the Big Island, one of the old folks there was pointing out that when chiefs were born or when something would happen in a chief's life, they would modify the palm trees. They would wrap the palm trees in fiber, basically in rope, and actually shape them the same way they shape bonsai trees. So this is what considered, in modern translation, this was considered one of the royal groves in Waikiki. And so many of the palm trees here, you plant a palm tree when a chief was born. Particular palm trees would be identified and apparently named with the name of that chief. As that chief went through their lives, you would modify their palm tree to basically almost make like a biography in a tree. So this tree here would have been one of the chiefs, most likely, and given various life events would have been modified or shaped or bent in ways to reflect the life changes that occurred. So that's one reason most of these palm trees have kinks in them. Those kinks aren't natural. Here's a palm tree that wasn't really modified. Hawaiian palm trees tend to grow fairly straight. If they're bent all over the place, that's almost invariably because people did that intentionally to them. This is why it was so hoo-hoo in the early 20th century, in the 1920s and 30s, for example, when they cut down this whole grove to put in I don't know, hotels or whatever. Huge numbers of people were totally outraged because as far as they were concerned, these palm trees not only were palm trees, but they actually were tied in terms of their mana to the particular chief who they were part of. But one of the things that really upset people when this particular grove was cut down is almost no one could remember who the palm trees were tied to. By the 1920s, people remembered to a vague way what the palm trees signified, but they could not tell you who they were the life history of anymore. And that says something about the massive changes that occurred in our relationship with the land, and especially with the Hawaiian identity with place that occurred in the late 19th, early 20th century. It's not so much that you get rid of the grove. It's the fact that prior to that, people didn't remember what the grove stood for. because this was basically the biography of a whole group of chiefs that were all Oahu chiefs. And their biography by that time had been lost. People might remember the names, they might still have a chant, but they couldn't tell you that chant related to this particular tree anymore. The relationship with the land had been snapped or severed. And so when you look at that, the other part of this that's really key is, of course, what you see here is a classic lo'i. This is lo'i here, there's lo'i over here. This actually looks like one of the small fish ponds over here. So this is what you had. Waikiki was wet fields. It was like Honolulu looks today. And here you see one of the small storage sheds that was built that you'd either, crash out in for the afternoon if it was too hot out. You'd keep your tools in here. And so this is the way Waikiki looked. Now, in the 1820s, from ships coming in from Mexico, at least that's according to the accounts in one of the articles in Hawaii Journal of History. In the 1820s, ships coming in from Mexico bringing their water cask ended up bringing not only mosquitoes, but also the scorpions and the centipedes. So those are brought in from Mexico, probably with the cattle and horses they were bringing in from Mexico at the time, into the 1820s. So when the mosquitoes get in here, they immediately, of course, infest these waters. And then you end up with a huge mosquito problem, as you might imagine. On top of that, by the 1830s, 1840s, almost none of the fields in Waikiki was actually in use. If you've ever actually worked in lo'i, they're very labor intensive, and my back hurts just even looking at this thing. And so you've got one person, I think there's one person down here working on this. Yeah, you got one guy working in here. He's got one big lo'i here, actually a huge one open. He's got another one here. These here where the coconut trees have been potted, that wouldn't be a lo'i. It looks like an Hawaii here. And then, yeah, that's pretty much got to be, that's a wall over here. Okay, that's probably a Waikiki Road there. So what you've got is one of the last functional lo'i. That's probably why this picture was taken. This might have been the last actual dalo patch in Waikiki that was actually in functional use in this period by the 1850s, 1860s. Within a couple of years, this guy would have quit, gone to something that was a lot easier. And these things would have fallen out of use. Now, of course, the water's still going into them. So basically what you end up with now is just scungy ponds. And that's what Waikiki turns into. In the 1870s, Chinese who are getting off of the plantations or escaping the plantations come down to this area, contact the landowners, and turn this into rice fields, which is typical of all of this part of Oahu. We became a huge production center for rice. In fact, for a while, we were actually shipping rice to California, not only providing just the rice here, but actually shipping it as a major food crop to California. And a lot of that was actually coming out of basically what's now Kaka'ako / Waikiki. So this area turned back into production for a period of time. But then by the 1880s, 1890s, it's still in rice production, but the problem is with the mosquitoes are, of course, still there. Rice production doesn't require moving water like dalo does. So so what you've got here is this area, when this is in rice, you're going to have just literally clouds of mosquitoes. And so what the authorities decide to do, based on the pressure from your very powerful, very important people who are living on the shore in Waikiki and don't like this, is they basically demand that this all be changed, that you modify all this, that you get rid of these nasty pestilential, ponds of mosquitoes. And so in that context, Dillingham, I can't remember what his initials were, who was already famous for building the train system, the Oahu Railway that basically went through this part of the island of Oahu, had already made him a ton of money. He then actually goes to the territory and proposes that what they do is they channelize the streams coming down from here, which of course that lo'i was probably right about here. So that field system we just looked at was probably here. So basically what they say is, okay, what we want to do is we want to drain all this, and that includes basically this entire area. So what they do is they basically take the streams, they change the flow of the streams. So they change the streams, they rammed them down. In fact, if you notice, this is one reason why all of a sudden when you look at the stream here, one, they merged Pololo and Manoa streams. Manoa used to go here, Pololo used to go here. So what they do is they ram them together, they ram them this way, make an entirely new artificial ditch, and they make a secondary artificial ditch here that does two things. One is this drains all of this area here, because this whole area here is basically at sea level. So you drain this whole area of Waikiki, which was mudflats and lo'i and fish ponds. You then dig a channel here and you run the water out through what's now the Ala Canal. You then bring in the amount of dirt that you dug out of here and you fill Waikiki. So when you look at Waikiki, if you walk down Kohiu or Kalakaua Avenue, you're actually walking on landfill. That's not the actual land surface. If you want to see the actual land surface, go and look at the Alawai golf course. So all of Waikiki has been basically artificially raised from the dirt they dug out here, and also they dredged out of the coral flats. This whole area here has been heavily dredged, and then it was piled in here. So they killed the reef in two ways. One is they put the beach here, and secondly is they actually intentionally blew up with dynamite and dredged basically huge parts of the reef, and then piled it up in here to bring this higher above sea level so it wouldn't flood during high tides. So Waikiki is entirely artificial. Now, there's nothing natural about Waikiki. It would all be underwater in high tide if it was still its original form. So in that context, that's the Alawai Canal. This, of course, has become a huge issue right now because, among other things, they did this, and because they really didn't understand, well, and I don't think particularly cared about the way hydrology or water studies actually work. The way these streams flow down is pretty much like a straight pipe. So they would flush out the sediments and other stuff they had in them and get flushed out here. When you bring these things together, you put them here and you put them here and put them at a right angle, all the stuff that's coming down these streams gets choked up here, and then it gets choked up here, which is why the Alawai Canal basically is considered a near Superfund site. It's been years since I ever used to paddle down there, but that place is infamous for, if you get a cut, you're going to get a staph infection within 2 or 3 hours, or even if you just bruise yourself. It's a deadly dangerous place to be. And that's because what you've done is you've taken all the sediments that would normally be flushed out, and you basically trapped them in here. You made one of the world's ugliest, nasty ponds out of what were clear flowing streams. Not to mention all of a sudden your opu and everything else that would be in here just basically toxed out. So you completely changed the ecosystem for this region entirely, and in a very calculated, intentional way. Now, what you also do, and I don't think this was actually intentional, well, it was intentional because all the fill that they didn't put any of the fill on this side. Makuli Moili didn't get any fill. I used to live for years, I lived up on Baratini, just off of Baratini up here in Makiki. And whenever it rains, that area ends up with about 2 or 3 feet of water for a couple of days afterwards because it's still pretty much at sea level. So what they did is they spent all the money improving on the area Makai of the Alawai Canal. So this area, that's one reason why if you look at Waikiki, that's why Waikiki looks so different than Kapahulu. All the money that was spent by the territory and private developers was spent on basically making this a special place. And also it also ends up looking like a moat. You also actually physically separate Waikiki from the entire area around it. Now, when Dillingham was, just as a note, when Dillingham was done messing around with all this, there was a bunch of extra fill that they dug out here. They put some of that extra fill here, which is, of course, Magic Island / Ala Moana Beach Park. This is the actual original beach shores back here. So even Ala Moana Beach Park is largely artificial. This is entirely artificial. This is filled in reef. This was actually underwater, then they piled stuff on top of it. Here you see what's left of the original reef front. Here you can sort of see a pattern here. So this is artificial too. And then what he did is he took extra fill because it was part of his payment from the government was in dirt basically. And he piled it up here and built the base of what's now Ala Moana Center. So you can get pictures from the 1930s where this enormous pile of dirt and sand and coral up here that then becomes leveled. That's AMC or Ala Moana Center. So this whole area is basically an artificial construct. So when people are talking about environmental impacts or beach erosion or almost anything else in this area, and you know anything of the history of the place, you just start looking at them like, dude, what the hell are you talking about? There's nothing real about the place. It's like a terrarium. It's artificial. So now the key thing about that is sort of two things. This was a very good example of the changing way that we viewed the Hawaiian Islands, but especially Oahu, because you have to remember Oahu and especially Honolulu becomes the most westernized and the most Americanized of the islands. And in the American system by the 20th century, but even before that, but especially in the 20th century, there was a huge conviction that science and technology could fix anything. Now, you, of course, can see this in 2020 with the insistence that a vaccine is going to show up and everything's going to happen, and all of a sudden in a month, poop, no one's going to have COVID and everyone's going to forget within a year that ever happened. That's a very American attitude that science and technology can fix anything if you just throw enough money and enough people at it. Never mind, a lot of stuff that actually happens isn't subject to being fixed by science and technology. That's a very limited approach. The Hawai'i Canal was a good example of science and technology. You don't like what Mother Nature does because it floods sometimes. So what you do is you build your own version of an improved stream. You then modify it and put it in concrete to make sure it runs the way exactly that you want it. And of course, you make it nice straight lines because that looks good. And then what you do is you build this thing, and of course it's going to work, right? Because this is the science and technology, man controlling nature. This is a very, even more so than Europeans, this is a hugely American thing. Americans see nature as being a, I don't even know how to describe it. They see nature as being basically uncontrolled, undisciplined, and wild. And one of the functions of civilization and knowledge is to control and discipline and tame nature. The same way that you'd catch a wild cat here, a feral cat on campus, and you bring it in to be a house cat. That's like a baby version of all this. This is the same type of thing, that you can take natural conditions and you can slap enough engineering and science and technology into it, and bang, you can fix it. You'll get rid of the flooding. You'll get rid of the problems. You'll have a nice, pretty new beach, and you'll build a little fantasy world that's sort of like Disneyland circa 1930. And you can do that because that's what you can do with science and technology and engineering. Of course, the irony right now, of course, one of the huge issues is trying to figure out how they're going to fix the flooding that occurs with the Hawai'i Canal, because it's actually exacerbated a huge number of situations. But ironically, what we're talking about doing, at least with the Corps of Engineers, is they want to re-engineer the whole thing again. So you don't talk about going back to looking at the systems that actually worked, that were actually reflective of the natural systems. You just lay more engineering on more engineering on more engineering to basically still try to control natural conditions. The Hawai'i Canal is probably one of the best examples. It's frequently used actually in engineering studies in Europe and in Asia for the fallacy of the ability of engineering to control natural conditions. It's oftentimes a poster child for dumb ideas. Now in that context, if you think about it, the other huge impact of the 20th century, if Waikiki was one of them, the other huge impact I was mentioning last time was the car, the automobile. So when the car comes in, several things happens. Initially, of course, what happens, as I mentioned last time, people start to move on to slopes, and all of a sudden being up high becomes more attractive than being low and convenient and close. So people start to disperse out. And if you notice, when they move out, rather than moving in the valleys, in many cases, they actually move on to the ridges if they can. And of course, in the 1950s, 1960s, of course, engineering pops back in. Kaiser, who of course is also the Hilton, basically decides to do a massive case of 20th century engineering, blows out the fish ponds here that were this part of what's now Hawaii Kai, and basically turns into this massive subdivision run by him and largely Bishop Estate land in conjunction with Kaiser, build this whole new town. You have to remember, when people talk about the second city, that's what Hawaii Kai was supposed to be. In the 1950s and 60s, Hawaii Kai was touted as the new city for the people that didn't want to live in town, that wanted more space and be a little more in a suburb. And because of individual cars, people could do that. They could go out here and they could sort of mindlessly drive in, until, of course, too many of them do it, and now they're all stuck in traffic. So in that context, what happens is the second big change, and you see it right here. In Europe, especially in Germany in the 1930s, one of the things that impressed everyone in Europe, much as they didn't like the Germans necessarily, was what were called the Autobahns. The Germans came up, for military reasons, came up with the idea of these massive highways that were limited to high-speed travel, which were actually originally mainly to shift military units around Germany. So they had this system in place by the time World War II starts. By the end of World War II, and the Allies have taken over Europe and taken over Germany, everyone's looking at these things going, damn. Now, from the US government, the federal government standpoint, freeways made a lot of sense because they had already seen what you could do. The Germans were able to move stuff around incredibly quickly on these enormous ribbons of concrete. And so the United States, which only had highways, if you want to see this, go and Google Route 66, for example, come up with the idea that, well, whatever the Germans could do, we could do better because the Americans are better technologically, again, engineering, da-da-da-da-da. And so the federal government sponsors the building of freeways. And in fact, if you think that's what the word means, freeway, in the sense of free travel, fast travel on a way, which just is another word for road. So you could call them free roads. And so the freeway system gets built in the mainland United States, largely with military interest in mind. So the freeways are designed to link the United States across the continent, and also link areas of military interest. In Hawaii, what you get is by the 50s, freeway systems are largely extant in the United States. They make enormous changes in the mainland United States. This is when LA suddenly turns into the LA that we know, is because of the freeway systems that come in. Other areas like San Francisco, pretty much, which are already there, freeways end up being sort of slapped in them. Portland, Oregon is a real good example of a freeway that gets laid right in the middle of the city and splits it apart even today. Here in Honolulu, because by the 1950s, 1959, we become a state, is there's an insistence by the state government that if you're an actual state, you got to have a freeway. So this was a status thing. If you were states, you should have one of these things because states had freeways. So don't ask me the logic of it, it just was sort of what it was. Also by that period of time, with the enormous number of private automobiles, is the streets were incredibly congested. Traffic jams were very common because all you had were roads. You can visualize, if suddenly all the schools opened up back tomorrow, you guys know fully well what Waialae Avenue turns into between 8 and 9 in the morning. Imagine all the streets being like that if you had no freeways. So by the 1960s, there was a huge insistence that you needed to have a fast way to move people across the congested part of the island due to the enormous dominance of the private automobile. Now, the interesting thing is what you could have brought in is you could have brought in forms of rapid transit, which is what they did and still do in Asia. But that wasn't acceptable because by this period already, the private automobile become dominant. And if you said, oh, we're going to build a nice, like Tokyo type rail system, the first things that people up here would have been saying is like, well, hold it, Newt, how the hell am I supposed to get home? I'm going to walk, not going to walk 2 miles uphill. So the fact that people had already used the automobile to disperse themselves meant that it was basically impossible to build a rapid transit system that would work effectively. So the alternative was literally to just basically condemn enormous pieces of property and slap a freeway right down the middle of Honolulu. Now, the part that we're in is probably one of the most dramatic examples of this, because I got, my Hawaiian family actually had one of our great uncles actually lived, let's see, right here, I think. And part of the family lived over here. Now, before the freeway was built, they would all, if you were gonna, in fact, no, they were here because they don't have access. I can't remember which one. And so what they would have, if you had to leave your kid because you have to go to work or something like that, you drop your kid off at your auntie's place down here. Because very typical in Chinese Hawaiian, the family would buy a bunch of houses around each other, sort of a modern version of a Chinese family compound. So a lot of the houses in Kaimuki were actually, they might be individual homes, but within a particular street, you'll find maybe 4 or 5 family members living in houses that are contiguous to each other. So in some ways, it was like family compounds. Very typical in much of Asia, both Japanese, Chinese, Koreans, Okinawans, all those groups do that. And very typical here. Well, all of a sudden in the 1960s, when they built the freeway, the government came in and basically condemned houses. So they'd knock on whoever's house this was and basically say, okay, we're putting a freeway through here. We're going to give you X amount of money, which is market rate for this property. You got to move out by January 5th or something like that. And that's it. You have no say in it. And all of a sudden, blam, they put the sucker down. In the case of some of the relatives now, if you were going to go leave your kid with your auntie, you now had to go 1 or 2 streets over, go under the freeway, come over and drop them off. So you couldn't just walk them down the street anymore, so it didn't happen. So all of a sudden, Kaimuki got split in 2, just like with a huge knife. And many of the other neighborhoods did too, where they basically got cut apart by all of a sudden this imposition of this huge, supposedly fast transit system. Now, it's important to remember that at least initially, it actually worked. Kalihi got actually clobbered even worse. Because what happened is all of a sudden now, if you were near the freeway, you could get places really quickly. If you were further away from the freeway, it was a little harder. If you were commercial properties, all of a sudden being near a freeway made a hell of a lot of sense because that meant that you now had real good access to a lot of people in a hurry. And so in that context, the freeway totally changed the dynamic of the relationship of areas like suburbs. Now, it wasn't so much whether it took 5 minutes on Waialae Avenue. Now it was, are you near the 12th Street exit? So what happened was the way that people related to the land area changed dramatically with the development of the freeways. Now, initially, when these things were designed in, of course, it was to move people rapidly. So what you get then, of course, as you move out here to the west, is when they decide in the late 20th century that what they really want to do is move people more to basically the west, the leeward part of the island, to basically free up the downtown area from overcongestion as they start to push the freeways out. And in doing so, basically then encourage growth in these areas through Pearl City, et cetera. And then, of course, what happens in the 1990s, early 2000 period, is they push the freeway expansion out this way. And the state government basically argues and builds, despite city opposition, I should point out, the new city or second city of Kapolei, which has been incredibly recent. And in many ways is actually, this is part of the mainland that happens to be in the Hawaiian Islands. Mililani is a little bit of this, but the Kapolei Ewa area has basically turned into classic socioeconomically divided neighborhoods that are very, very typical of most of them, for example, the Western states, but are totally in contrast to places like Kaimuki, Palolo, Kalihi, et cetera, where they're very mixed communities. These are very, very segregated communities. Everyone in here paid the same amount for their house, and if they make any more money, they'll move to another house. So this is brought in basically the mainland. This is mainland planning, and it's driven by the freeway. The freeway access allows you to put in a city. Now, of course, if you live out here, you realize that one of the more dumb aspects of all this is it entirely ignores the fact that if you get a lot of people doing that, then they're all going to be stuck going on the freeway at the same time. You end up with the massive traffic jams we have. And we have some of the worst traffic jams in the entire United States. On top of that, one of the more surreal aspects is that in terms of actual amount of pavement, we have more cars per square meter of pavement than any place else in the world. We're completely off the charts compared to any place. We have more cars for every foot, if you want to think of that, pavement, or if you want to, less pavement per car than any place else on the planet. There are places that are much more densely occupied, Hong Kong, Tokyo, et cetera. But there, what you have is public transportation. Large parts of the population have never owned a car and don't even have a driver's license. I would estimate maybe 70% of the population in Hong Kong, for example, doesn't have a driver's license. And there'd be no point in having it. You can never afford a car. So what you end up in Hawaii is a nightmare. You end up with basically a freeway system that's not functional, because as fast as you build the roads, people buy more cars. And they buy an insane amount of cars. I mean, where I live now, which is townhouses in the back of Waialainui, the folks that live on the street, on average, I'd say those families all have 3 to 4 cars per house. Even the folks that live in our little townhouse thing, the average is, they're 2-car garages, and there's constant competition because I'd say half the families have 3 cars. And this is with 2 adults. You're talking about 2 drivers and 3 cars, or 3 drivers and 4 cars. You're not talking about 5 drivers and 2 cars. What you're talking about is more cars than people. In fact, the statistic for Hawaii is, I believe, 1.3 cars per person. It's by far the highest in the world. So what you have is a small island. This is unique to Oahu, that basically is dying in cars, or smothering in terms of automobiles. And what that means is, ironically, these road systems, the road nets, are unable to handle this. It's been estimated, if you actually want to deal with the amount of traffic that if you want the H1 to flow freely, you'd have to actually double the lanes. In fact, the Department of Transportation plan eventually is to double deck the freeway. So there'd be 6 lanes of traffic in here, 3 going this way, 3 going that way, which is fine till all of a sudden you realize, that sounds pretty good till you suddenly visualize if you're taking the off ramp here to go onto Waialae. So you're here, and then see, here's Market City. So if you take this freeway exit, you'd have to have 3 lanes of coming off the freeway exit, which means you'd be doubling the number of cars that hit Waialae Avenue, Kapiolani Boulevard here. You'd be doubling the number of cars that are trying to get down Waialae Avenue. You'd be doubling the number of cars that are trying to get down to Kapahulu. So you basically, the entire city just gets into gridlock, which is a technical term, which means basically where cars cannot move because there's so many cars they can't flow through the system. We have more days of gridlock again than any place else in the United States, where basically cars get locked in place because there's just so many cars coming onto the roads that you can't get them off. It's one of the huge changes in COVID is the realization how car dependent we were when all of a sudden people don't have reason to go around. You can actually get places. But now it's starting to pick back up again. And if you notice, traffic's gotten a lot worse. And I can guarantee you by March or something like that, we'll be back to where we were before. And everyone will be going, what are we going to do with the traffic? Well, we're the problem. It's not the cars, it's the people that own the cars. It's the idea that you have to have more than one automobile. There's a whole set of mental attitudes, incredibly strange for an island environment when you consider this entire problem is covering an area of roughly 16 miles this way and less than a mile this way. And yet you've got 1 million people, roughly 900,000 people on this island, roughly 800,000 on this side of the island, and I believe 1.6 million cars. So actually almost a 2-to-1 ratio of cars to automobiles for Honolulu, which, you know, is insane by any stretch of the imagination. So the freeway system is interesting because it changed entirely the relationship of neighborhoods in terms of within neighborhoods like Kaimuki. But it also, in a more important way, what it is totally changed the relationship of parts of the island. All of a sudden, living in Waipahu, or like I used to live in Aiea, Pearl City, and driving into work here, became a normal idea. Of course, you had to leave, if you folks live out there. If you live in Aiea, Pearl City, and you got to get into school at 8 o'clock, you have to leave around 5:30 or 6, because the freeway is going to seize up by 6:30 or you're parking for another 2 hours. And you have to leave work here by 3. Because if you leave at 3:30, you're not going to get home till 6. And this is what was supposed to be high speed, you know, almost mindless being able to move around an island with no effort. And of course, it's turned into anything but. That's simply because of the number of people on the roads. So from an environmental standpoint, the freeway system was an absolutely incredibly bad idea. In some ways, it would have been better to do like they do in parts of Asia, like Hong Kong, and you basically don't build a lot of freeways. You just make it so that people want to get around, they can't use a car. For example, in most of Japan, if you live in Tokyo or Osaka or one of the other urban areas, you cannot buy a car unless you actually get a citation from the police that says you have a place to park that car, which is actually uniquely yours. So you couldn't buy a second car if you had a one-car garage. You are not allowed to park on the street. You're not allowed to park in any sort of pay parking. You have to have a place that's uniquely yours. Before you go into a dealership, they want to see that form. You cannot purchase an automobile unless you can prove that you have your own unique place to put it. And the reason they did that was very simply to avoid places like this. Honolulu is very frequently brought up when people talk about traffic studies, attitudes towards cars, automobile pollution and stuff. Honolulu is oftentimes brought up as the poster child of incredibly bad planning, one, but also social attitudes that are basically entirely dysfunctional in an island environment. So at the same time, we talk about things like aloha aina, we love the environment, we want Hawaii to be attractive and nice and the men will live here. At the same time, we're literally killing ourselves with the cars. You know, our desire for convenience has put us in a situation where we're basically, in a very slow way, committing suicide. And it's surreal, but it's very, in some ways, we're reflective of American society in general, but it just shows how dysfunctional a society can be when you put it in a constricted land space like Honolulu. So the car, and of course this area, Kaimuki, St. Louis Heights, Wilhelmina Rise, the freeway. You know, if you just think about your life in cars, you know, we're dominated by them, and that's as older neighborhoods like we have here around us. That becomes very difficult. And this is why you find on-street parking is incredibly hard to find. Why? Because huge numbers of people have a lot more automobiles than they do space. So they use public space to park in. And then when they go home, they have to find public space to park in. Why? Because they've got 3 cars, because there's the car the family uses, there's the car I use, and there's my, you know, my or party car, my cute car, my favorite car, my own car, whatever you want to call it. You know, we're a very strange group of people, and our ability to ignore our environment, both in the freeways and the Alawai Canal, is sort of surreal, given oftentimes the rhetoric you see here, especially on the island of Oahu, for, you know, and concern about environmental issues. You know, it's funny, people will go to environmental meetings and they drive there in their cars. I start thinking about it and like, okay, so one of the side effects of Zoom is you don't have to do that. Okay, so any questions on all that? Feel free to consider yourself, when you're wherever you're going and coming from the rest of this week, consider yourself doing a field study.